Welcome to the Straight from the Source's Mouth podcast. Frank talk about sex and dating.
All right. Hello and welcome to episode number 21 of season 2. My name is Tamara and you're listening to the Straight from the Source's Mouth podcast. Carissa is back today and today's guest is Heidi Gruss, and she's a psychotherapist, transformation strategist, and entrepreneur. We'll be talking about no longer tolerating bullshit in relationships and the balance between boundaries and qualifying a partner. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Tamara and Chris. I'm excited to really talk about this topic. And first, I want to bring your listeners' attention to our own pre-podcast conversation where we were talking about, should we even call this podcast like tolerating the bullshit or not? And I thought it was so important that we keep to the terminology and really address what is that resistance with even addressing that we do tolerate bullshit. And may that be the same resistance that we feel when we're in that circumstance where we know it's just not right, but yet we resist addressing the situation because it means having to start over, or it means having to get uncomfortable, or it means that we might make the other person uncomfortable. And so it's so interesting to me that was the dynamic starting off for today's podcast.
Yeah, definitely. And I've been in that circumstance where you stayed a little longer than you should. With one guy, it was because we kept having trips planned. So I'm like, all right, after the next trip, I'll break up with him for sure. And then so finally when we didn't have a trip, I'm like, all right, we got to do it this time. But yeah, I can see that for sure.
And there's never a good time. It's, and let me say this, right? When I'm talking about tolerating the bullshit, it's typically, something that isn't working for us. And it pulls on that, discomfort. And we always put off or try to avoid doing the thing that makes us uncomfortable. We resist change for as long as we can until it gets to that point where everything in us is telling us this is not working for us. And so, when I'm working with clients, it's like, why can't we step into that sooner? Because if we look at how much time it's costing us to keep tolerating, we could be so much further along, maybe have found the next best relationship.
I really liked what you said there, Heidi. I think it's not just tolerating. I think it's also, like complacency, and maybe we might have some feelings of unworthiness to find something better. So, and there's a lot of emotional energy that's being expended, and I think we discount that as women. We think that we always have to be expending a lot of emotional energy. I find that I do that myself.
Yeah, I think, your point about the self-worth and the emotional energy, we have stories in our head about what we should be doing, right? Those obligatory things, what we should be tolerating or what, how we should be behaving. And I encourage my clients to start writing their own rules and to start confronting those stories to figure out, where do they come from? Because how you're managing one relationship in your life is a reflection of how you're managing other relationships in your life. It's going to be, we as human beings, as much as people say, I love to just have flexibility in my life. And I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, right? And they talk about this time freedom thing, but really we love predictability. In fact, we create it through our patterns. And so how we show up in one relationship really is how we're showing up in other relationships. It's just not so obvious, right? It might not be staring us in the face in the same way that it is in the relationship that we're most focused on at the given time.
Yeah, not just relationships, like you said, other areas of life, like you said, the career, how you do everything you do. How you do one thing, you do everything.
How you do one thing is how you do all things. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And we had talked about the difference between boundaries and dismissing or qualifying. Like, talk about that a bit. Cause I mentioned I was in a Facebook, or I am in a Facebook group with people, and it seemed to be generational, but a lot of the younger women seem to have really strong boundaries, and that's great. If it's true boundaries versus writing off people, before it even gets started because they're afraid, or I don't know, like maybe just talk about that, the distinction between those two.
Yeah. So I think, with boundaries, boundaries are necessary in all of our relationships, but I think we have to look at, what's the purpose of the boundary? Because for some, the boundary is to keep people out. And that is a fear-based boundary. And when we start to unpack that a little bit, we have to look at how can we reframe the boundary so it's really about honoring our needs. You see the difference, right? It's self-protection. I don't want to get hurt versus, I'm going to implement a boundary so that I'm honoring myself. I'm taking care of myself. Because, and that's why, so much of this and so much of my program, the transformation methodology, is about developing this success mindset. And I don't mean success in terms of, you're earning a certain amount of money, or you've, gotten the next promotion, or it's really about developing your lifestyle so that your life is working for you. Right. And so you're really aware of, when the situation happens with your partner and it doesn't sit well with you, you feel it. And then you respond to that feeling. It's like our body sends us all the cues that we need to keep us in a good space. It's just, are we honoring those cues and signals? Are we listening to them? Because when we don't, the signals just become louder. They become more intrusive. They become more disruptive to our lifestyle flow. But in the beginning, it's just that gut punch where it's like, what? They just said what to me? Like, this does not sit well at all. Okay, so now what are you going to do about that? And that's where, there's that fear, that uncertainty, that overwhelm of, and language is key. It's like, how are you going to address that? And so many times I hear from my clients, like, I don't like confrontation. I don't like conflict. Okay, let's call it something different. How are you going to address that? How are you going to talk about that? Because that's what a confrontation is. It's a dialogue. And you know what? Go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, well, that was yeah, no, that was going to be my point on the Facebook group. That's what I tried to say, like, ask the person why they said what they said if it didn't agree with you, versus dismiss or delete them or unmatch them immediately. Because I was saying it's an opportunity for the men to learn and the women to get clear what that was really going on. But a lot of women just dismiss immediately or unmatch, and they say it's healthier for them. So I guess that's the dichotomy where I ask what you see there.
I mean, healthier. I mean, here's the thing. If you're unwilling to have the conversation, to really unravel and understand the other person's intention behind their statement or their behavior, means that you're committing to the same interpretation, which most likely links back to a story in your head that you tell yourself. That whenever he, behaves, whenever he speaks in that authoritative tone, right, it means he's taking power over me, right? Yeah. When it doesn't, that's the interpretation.
Yeah.
That's the stuff we're bringing to the relationship.
Yeah, I guess because in this instance, it's more like first dating, when you're first messaging each other, and they would be like, a large amount of the younger women would say, oh, he said this, so I immediately dismiss him. They're like, yeah, dismiss him. And it just seems like sometimes, maybe not all the time, it was premature where they could have found out where he was coming from, but they just say it's a red flag and I'm got rid of him. And so, and I know I'm beating this, what do you call it? Beating a dead horse now, but yeah, I guess it's also describe it in the dating world, in the messaging phase and the getting to know you phases of the feelings, what you're talking about here.
And Heidi, I actually really liked that you mentioned that words matter, word choice matters. And I have a 20-year-old son who actually just moved out, and he and I have a conversation often because he'll say something to me and I'm like, do you really understand what you said to me? I mean, the choice of words you just used, I received in this way. So is that what you were trying to communicate? Because that's not right. And so I've been practicing that word choice, and I've been calling people out when they use words that I don't like, or they'll start something off. They're trying to say something positive, but it comes out in a negative way. So I really like that you brought that up. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I think, I remember one time there was a client who kept calling me lady, right? She was like, lady, I just, lady. And I was really turned off. I was like, oh my God, like it felt just sort of like dismissive. And, I felt like, kind of being silenced a little bit, right? And I'm like, I just need to understand. And I was like, how does that translate for you when you say lady? You use it so casually that I'm just curious. And she said, oh, in my circle, everybody's lady. It's like how, some people might say sis or girl or, and so for me, I was like, oh, okay, I can connect with that because I'll say girl, you got to listen to what I'm saying, so then all of a sudden I could understand the intention behind her statement. But I think acknowledging when something hits us the wrong way, it's making a decision. Do I want to step into this and ask the question? I'm just a little confused. I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean by this. Or is this what you meant? Because if it isn't, I don't want to make that assumption here. But asking the clarifying question. But I think it comes back to getting clear on when do we want to step into that arena and clarify our confusion, or when is the approach or the remark just so abrasive that it's not even worth our time.
Exactly.
Right? Because it's self-worth on both ends. It's like, you know what? You just got this all wrong right off the bat. Like it's not even worthy of a response from me, right? That's asserting oneself and stepping into your power. But then there's also times where it's like, if you're constantly just writing everybody off, well, that's a pattern. And so then we need to just stop for a second and look at why. Why is every single man who's approaching you quickly written off? Perhaps we need to slow this down and look at what's the button they're pushing.
Yeah, I like that. I think I'm going to bring that up in the group. Just say, if it's a pattern for you, just, maybe look inward. And if not, then it may be the guys.
But we also, with when we stop tolerating the bullshit, it's also about acknowledging that we're not living on a wish and a hope. So I know we were just chatting briefly, earlier, and one of the circumstances that was brought up that I hear all the time too is that we stay in relationships because we've already invested so much time. Right. And so, and it can happen in the dating world. It happens in marriage, but please acknowledge the thought process first, because if you're entertaining a relationship in that way, then you're going to stay in the marriage longer than you should. You're going to stay in the job with working with a manager longer than you should, who's doing the same types of things. It's the same patterns. But time is all we have. And if you're seeing the same things happening over and over and over again, and your reason for staying is because you've already invested 4 months, 8 months, 4 years, and it's like, oh my gosh, to start all over again. It's like, well, staying is not getting you any closer to what it is you want.
Yeah, I do stand up too. And I joked about if we all broke up at the same time, we'd all have a whole new pool of people to go after. So we could designate a date if everyone hates their, you know what I mean? Anyway, go ahead, Chris. What were you going to say?
Well, so I was going to say, two things. Number one, specifically about this and staying in a relationship. I don't know. I can't recall who or where I heard this, but if you are staying in a relationship and there is if that wrong person is holding a space in your life for a relationship, then a new person can't come into that space because that space is already occupied. So if you're trying to build something new and better, or find somebody new and better for you, and you have the wrong person in that space, then that new person can't come in.
There's no, yeah.
And then
Great point.
back to just kind of another really quick thing back to words matter. Some people like to say, shut up or be quiet or something like that to someone. And that's a trigger for me. And I know it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's from when I was younger, always being told, shut up.
Mm-hmm.
But, instead of using those words, it's like, could you talk in a softer voice? Or I don't like the way you're speaking to me. Why are you saying that? Instead of don't tell me to shut up, and then creating that argument. So that was just back to the words matter. But I tell all my friends, you can't have somebody in a space in your life and you want to change it if somebody's still there.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, Chris, I just want to comment on something that you just said, right? Because I think all of your listeners are going to benefit from this. We all know what we need to be doing. Okay. You just shared with me the advice that you would give to your friend. And it's so obvious, right? Your friend comes and presents to you the circumstance that you're grappling with. But because it's your friend's circumstance, you can give the feedback, you can give the suggestions. It rolls off your tongue. It's so easy, right?
Take my advice. I'm not using it.
Right. So we all know what we should be doing, but yet we live out the shoulds for other people. We don't live by our own shoulds, our own needs. Do you see what I'm saying? And that's where we really have to reverse this. We really have to.
Yeah.
So it's not for lack of knowledge. I want to empower your listeners. It's not for lack of knowledge. It's not that you don't know what needs to be done. It's realizing that to get to the end goal, to get the reward, to have the magical relationship, you have to step into the fear, into the uncertainty, into the difficult dynamic, to go through it to get to the other side. You can't hop over it. That's living on that wish and a hope that it's just going to get better or that it's just going to resolve itself. It's not going to.
Yeah.
So
I want to.
We learn by doing. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I'm always offering resources. So I just want to mention a book one time that talks about this as well. Calling in the One. Basically, you go through like a process or a phase of weeding people out. And that's one of the steps is getting rid of all those people in your space that aren't helping you move forward. If they're kind of pining over them or that kind of stuff. But anyway, calling in the One.
Yeah, but isn't it interesting that, you're bringing up books that, I haven't read, I haven't heard of, right? And I read I'm on book number 5 so far for this month, right? So I'm constantly reading things, but it's the same information constantly regurgitated, right?
True.
It's just, when are we going to not just recognize the information, but internalize it and accept it and apply it to our own situation? That's the difference. It's moving the knowledge from our head down to our heart, where we're able to live that out.
Well, and I think it's also, nobody takes action until they're ready, and they don't always, in their head, they're like, I know this isn't right. I know I shouldn't be doing this. Yes, it's easier, etc. But sometimes there's that catalyst that doesn't happen until they're ready.
I know what you're saying, Carissa, but here's my problem with this, and I disagree. It's not when people are ready that they start taking action. It's when their life circumstances have gotten that bad. They wait until it gets that bad. Because ready never happens. We're never ready. Think of any life circumstance that you've worked through. Nobody's ready to get the cancer diagnosis. Nobody's ready for that. You just get it and you have to face it. And so, have you ever heard of this story where they talk about, when you squeeze an orange, right? What comes out? You get orange juice, right? It's because that's what's inside that orange, right? And when you squeeze a person, what comes out of them is what they're filled with. And, in the dating world, don't you want to know what's really inside that person that you're dating? Right?
Yes.
Instead of doing the dance of, ooh, how can I get them to really like me? And how can I show that I really like them? And we're doing this little dance. It's really just a facade. But when we squeeze a little, and I'm not saying like we're wringing the towel, right? But we're just squeezing just a little. We get to see what's really inside there. And that's what we ultimately want to know.
Yeah. And that's where asking those clarifying questions you mentioned, when you're not sure, ask what they really mean. Go ahead, Claire.
So maybe clarify a little bit for me. And I think right there, that was where the words matter. Ready probably wasn't the correct word for me to use. But maybe clarify a little bit more about, like you said, doing a little squeezing to find out what's really inside there. Like, what would you say to bring that out?
When we're tolerating the bullshit, right? We're playing the nice game. We're so worried about being liked that we do what it is we think the other person wants to see from us or hear from us. We know how to people please, right? We know how to put on our best selves. Listen, you're high achieving, high functioning women. You can go into the interview and nail it because you know how to answer those questions, right? Well, you're attracting these partners who know how to do the same thing. They know how to play the game. They know how to answer the questions. So how can you ask them a little bit differently, right? Or how can you disrupt the dynamic just a little bit to see how patient are they? How supportive can they be? Hey, listen, I'm very excited for our date, but unfortunately I'm going to have to move it just because I've got something that's come up, with my children or with my parents or whatever. And I need to move the date. I need to move the date and time of our next meeting. Well, how flexible are they? How patient? And so start at your baseline. You'd have to give me kind of maybe a specific situation for me to build from that. But then it's like, what do you really need to know about the other person? What's the sticking point? If you're always finding yourself recreating, new relationships where it hits a wall at the same point. Well, what is it about that?
Yeah.
What is that point?
Can you give examples of what the kinds of stuff we should be to detect the bullshit, or like you're saying about check their patience and their supportiveness, and what are some other things like that?
But it's whatever is important to you. It's the nonsense. It's like, how many times, are you tolerating the thing that you're rolling your eyes about? Where there's always, it's the thing that's always happening.
Okay. Yeah. And each relationship is going to be specific to, yeah. Yeah, for one, like an ex-boyfriend, he liked that I liked whatever he wanted to do. He knew my love languages were quality time and physical touch. And I said, I'm like, as long as we're together, I don't care. So he took that to mean I get to do whatever I want and you'll be happy because you're there. And I was doing that. And that's the one that we used to take trips a lot, and the trips were fun, but he dictated what we did. And so I knew I wanted to get out of that because I was sick of doing everything he wanted to do. And like I said, once we had the last trip, I was like, all right, let me break up now.
So in that, I'm hearing themes about like how decisions are being made, right? How do you talk about, what that trip actually is going to be? Like, who makes the decision? Do you alternate? How important is your voice in the relationship? How are you feeling your voice being honored in the relationship?
And in that one,
you're getting the trip.
Yeah. And I did relent and say like, oh, up to you enough that he finally just started doing. So yeah, I probably started that trend. So yeah, good point.
So maybe that's a little bit of the bullshit. It's like, why are you afraid to speak up and say, I think next time we should really look at Charleston. Never been, it's been on my bucket list. Like, let's consider that.
Actually, now that you mention it, the 2 times I did assert myself and say, let's do this, he rolled his eyes and acted like he hated it. So yeah, that's probably why I didn't. But that was towards the end before we ended.
So there were 2 instances that you just kind of dismissed, right? So you tried and you didn't get the reaction you wanted, and something in your body reacted in that moment because you logged it. You just told me how he reacted. He rolled his eyes and you were like, oh, you got a message, right? You interpreted, he didn't like what I just said.
And I confronted him and I did say, this is the only thing I pick, and you want to sit here and bitch about it the entire time. Like, we were at a movie and he was just like, as long as I can drink. And I was like, it's like, that's not cool. So needless to say, we did end it, but probably it took longer than it should have because of the cool trips we were taking.
Because it sounds like in that moment though, like you even knew when you were going back and forth at the movie that you weren't seeing eye to eye on this.
Yeah.
And so then instead of going down the rabbit hole of it being about that trip, let's come out and take a macro view. And what's the bigger theme here?
Yeah. It did help that we were long distance.
And so
I didn't have to deal with it regularly. So I think I stayed longer for that reason. It was only partial times.
But here's the thing, right? We leave those interactions like, man, I'm disappointed in the way that happened and the way that all went down. And so if something is sticking with you, because disappointment is part of relationships, but if it's a disappointment that's nagging at you, it's in the back of your head, right? You're having follow-up conversations with yourself about that interaction. That to me is a huge signal that you haven't closed up that interaction. And so you need to go and open up the conversation to say, and I've got a formula for this too. I need to talk to you about, something that happened last week, because I keep replaying it in my head and I don't want to jump to the conclusion that what I wanted to do for the trip didn't matter. So I wanted to talk to you about this because I need to know that in the future when we make plans, like, we're going to get to do some of the things that I want to do too. Right. And that's what I mean by squeezing just a little bit. Right. And then you wait for the response because what's in that person is going to come out. Right. If he gets defensive and he's like, what are you talking about? What do you mean the way I reacted? What it's like, this is why I'm bringing this up. See, I want to get clarification, right? I'm not accusing you. I'm just saying it keeps playing around in my head. I'm looking for clarification, but the defensiveness is your clarification.
Yes. And they would just say, oh, it's the tone you're using or, because I've been told I accuse often in the past. And yeah, it's like how you say it potentially, or just like you're saying that their defensiveness is the clue
But, if he responds, it's like, oh my goodness, that's not at all how I wanted you to walk away from that interaction.
Yeah.
Let's, so it really is that important that we go to Charleston on our next trip. Okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah. That's the ideal you want. Yeah. Yeah. Keep one of those guys.
But you see how by addressing it, by bringing it up here, you're now allowing it to all unfold for you rather than resisting, right? Resisting bringing up the conversation. You're hoping that you're wrong. You're hoping that, your interpretation of that interaction is just wrong. And so then you find yourself in the same situation the second time.
Yeah. And
there again.
Yeah, he was the third of a pattern, and I have broken that pattern. But yes, at the time, I knew he would have just said, then, yeah, this isn't working, or too bad, or whatever. So like I said, it was more, we had another trip planned. So once the trips were no longer planned, I was over with that pattern, and I can see where it's helpful to ask the questions early on and just take it. There's a lot of women that, like you said, they don't want to leave, so they're just going to blow it off. So the key is trusting your gut, feeling the feelings, I'm guessing is what you would say, but go ahead if you have more to say in general.
Realizing that, the discomfort that you're going to feel from bringing up, let me back up and say something, right? When we know we have to have a difficult conversation, it's going back to Chris's point about like being ready. We try to work ourselves up to a point where we think we are ready. Like where it's like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be tough, and I'm going to say what I need to say, and it's going to be good. And that's part of the problem, is that we psych ourselves up so much that we think after we have the conversation, we're going to feel good. When in fact, when we do it for the first time, it doesn't feel good. It feels completely wrong. Right? And it's going to, in the beginning, until you get comfortable with it. And you're only going to gain comfort and confidence in doing this by doing it, not by talking about it, not by reading about it. You've got to actually do it. And so you go into the conversation realizing or acknowledging this is going to be a little uncomfortable, but I've survived uncomfortable before. And in fact, every time that I tolerate this dynamic or this treatment, I'm uncomfortable. So which uncomfortable are you really choosing here? Because when you tolerate long enough, you get frustrated and you're angry, but you're angry at yourself for not doing anything about it. You're resentful towards yourself for not doing what you know you should be doing because you tell your girlfriend to do what you're not doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the aha.
Well,
Yeah, for
Heidi,
sure.
maybe for our listeners, I know we've talked about I guess confronting or squeezing in different ways, but maybe talk about some of the two other tools or that you give to your client or your clients to have those conversations. Like you said, it's not just when you're ready, it's you really, when you have that first visceral reaction to someone's behavior or speech or whatever it is, to then how do you in that moment stay calm, address it so that you establish that boundary in the beginning. Like, I mean, one of my biggest things is I don't want to text. I don't want to endlessly text with someone. And if they just keep texting, I'm like, okay, are we going to meet or are we going to keep this up? I mean, like I'm over it. I'm over just texting. How do we move this?
Yeah. Like when you work with clients, like what were some things you would do as a kind of like wrap up maybe?
Oh, we're almost opening up a whole nother big conversation, but listen here, it starts with really getting clear on what is the relationship you want to have, right? So if I'm working with you, you're my client, and you're like, I'm tired of tolerating the bullshit. Okay, first tell me, what do you want? So Krista, you just told me about something about you with communication, right? We're trying to develop an intimate relationship using the least intimate form of communication, right? So that, again, that's an example of something you're tolerating in your relationship that's really not working for you. So I'm asking you, Carissa, tell me about this relationship that you want to have. Well, I want to be with a man who can communicate openly, right? Who can be vulnerable, right? Who can talk, not just text, not someone who's going to hide behind a screen. Okay. And so tell me, what do you want in that relationship, right? Why is that important to you, right? What is your attitude? What is your energy? Who are you showing up as in this relationship? You have this man now who's willing to talk to you, FaceTime you if it's at a distance, or spend time, in-person time with you, to say the words, look you in the eye and say the words. Okay. And so who do you show up as when you're receiving that? Okay. Because when you're really clear about who you are, then it's really easy to say, does Carissa tolerate that in a relationship or not? You know, what is the Carissa who is making sure she's only dating those qualified, individuals? What does she tolerate? What questions does she ask? How does she communicate? Listen, text is great when we're just trying to figure out initial compatibility, but I got to tell you, I find texting to be the biggest breakdown in relationships, because I can interpret words a million different ways, and 70% of communication is nonverbal. So if you want an emoji to represent what I'm trying to say, like, I ain't your girl.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's not just about what do you want in the relationship. It's like, if you get all these things, who are you showing up as? Who are you offering to your partner?
Well, and I've done a lot of work on that, so hopefully I'm showing up in the right way to get what I need / want.
Yeah. And we did have another episode. I think you may have listened to that one too, Heidi, the post-divorce tips. So she got a lot of tips about, I will only text the first week, then I expect calls, or, maybe word it a little nicer or whatever. But yeah, that kind of stuff, I can see where that would be very helpful. So we can either do this in 2 parts, or we can wrap this segment up.
I think we do both. I think, of course people can, find me if they want, and I can give you those social handles, but I think there is so much here. And I saw Chris's message, maybe 2 parts, because there is a lot to this, and I could keep talking about this. So we can do a second part. Yeah, I think we should do a follow-up, and it would be a great opportunity too to, I don't know if your Facebook group is tied to this podcast, but ask listeners what other questions they have too.
Yeah.
That's always helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bring them right.
Okay. So why don't you tell us how we can get a hold of you, and then we'll also do a follow-up as well.
Yeah. So I keep it really easy. All of my social handles and my website is all Heidi Gruss. So HeidiGruss.com. Find me on IG, Facebook, LinkedIn as Heidi Gruss. And I encourage, if there are some listeners who, resonated with things that, were said today, and want to have that personal breakthrough and talk through, like, what is the barrier here? Why is this same relationship pattern coming up? To schedule that breakthrough call.
Okay. And the last name is spelled
and let's do the work.
Gruss, just so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we'll put that in the description as well. But I just want to make sure, if people are only listening, that they have the spelling of the last name. So Gruss, one more time. All right. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, definitely. I would be curious to hear what, I can go back to that same Facebook group. It's not tied to this podcast, but it is about dating. And I can ask those questions and have, just kind of mention the patterns and see if that brings up any more discussion. But thank you very much, Heidi and Carissa, again, for being on this show.
Thank you.
It was another one where people will learn a lot, sometimes at my expense with my own patterns of dealing with the bullshit. But Thanks again for listening to Straight from the Source's Mouth podcast. And if you loved the episode, definitely leave a review. All right. Thanks again.
Frank Talk, sex and dating educates.